I'm Dr. Ted Wohlgemuth. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, and I'm certified at the highest levels in 3 areas of addiction work: alcohol and drugs, gambling, and sexual addiction. I'm also certified as a master's addiction specialist. I've been in the field of working with addicts for almost 30 years, and I'm happy to make this presentation today and hope that I can extend to you a lot of the knowledge that I've gained over the years. Now let me begin with the title of this presentation, which is Addiction and the Brain. You should know that there was a time period, actually not too long ago, when this would have been seen as a very radical statement, addiction and the brain, connecting those two. The belief, for some time period, a long time period for that matter, was that addicts were weak-willed people, no willpower, no backbone, unstable people, and it's their own fault that they got into this mess and they can't get out of it. But as you will see, hopefully, that this is no longer the case. We now know that there is a very direct connection between addiction and the brain. Now, I'd like to say this to those of you who are addicts. If you're going to seek help, which I certainly hope you will when you get the opportunity, make sure the person you're meeting with and getting help from is certified in the field of addiction. Otherwise, it's most likely that they will not have the information needed to be of that much help for you. Now, as you're going to see, up until 1995, there was no real development in the field of addiction, but at that time, 1995, the whole addiction field changed. And I'll show you exactly why in just a few minutes here. But note also that it wasn't until 2011 that the field of psychiatry fully accepted the reality of addiction. So, let me begin now with my presentation on addiction. And I want to begin by going to the meaning of the word addiction itself. And that meaning is addiction equals enslavement. An addict is a slave to alcohol, a slave to drugs, a slave to gambling, a slave to sex, a slave to whatever it is that their brain has in effect fallen in love with. Now, I use that word love purposely because what happens in addiction is a love affair takes place between your brain and the behavior patterns that you've involved yourself in. As it says here in this slide, an addiction refers to a love relationship in which a person becomes so bonded to an object of desire that on their own, 3 very important words, on their own, they cannot stop their attachment. They're incapable of doing it all by themselves. They become slaves instead, slaves to whatever object they have fallen in love with. Now, we know that there are 2 types of addiction. The ingestibles, that is those things you take into your body, alcohol, drugs, and food, for example, and behavioral. And those are addictions like gambling, sex, spending, and so forth. Now, please note again that this is almost brand new, this understanding of both the ingestibles and the behaviorals. Previously, when you talked about addiction, all that was being referred to was alcohol and drugs. Now the field has expanded significantly to include these other addictions. Now, as this slide is saying to you, the brain falls in love, and that's exactly what happens. Addiction is a disorder of the brain in which anything pleasurable, anything exciting, anything that gives your brain a rush, a high, a thrill, or a profound sense of calming, as you get with opiates and fentanyl and so forth, can cause the brain to fall in love. And it falls in love with the object of its desire to repeat the behavior to the extent of repeating that behavior over and over and over again, regardless of how dire the consequences can be. This is, if you remember what I said earlier about 1995, that year being a radical departure point for the field of addiction. This is the person who is primarily responsible for that. Dr. Nora Volkow and her team of scientists at the Brookhaven Institute in New York, after their study of the brain very, very thoroughly, they came up with the conclusion that addiction is a disorder of the brain no different from other mental illnesses. This was revolutionary. This was breakthrough stuff. Because remember, up until that time, people were blaming the addict themselves. Now, a whole new vision takes place about what is involved in addiction. Now, in 1995, as I said earlier, Dr. Volkow and her team of brain scientists at the Brookhaven Institute made this breakthrough study that located the source of addiction. What was the primary cause of this in the brain? And they identified that as being the dopamine neurochemical system in the brain. Additional studies now have replicated Dr. Volkow's study and further developed it to include at least 3 parts of the brain being actively involved in addictive behavior, along with a genetic component. Now, genetics is important in the field of addiction. Most addicts belong to a family system in which genetics is involved. And there's more than one person who will result in addictive behavior. Let's look at what this rush of untold pleasure that the brain produces is really all about. It all begins when a pleasurable action is performed. You do something that excites you, something that interests you, something that brings real sense of fun and so forth to your life. What's happening is neurons in the reward pathway of the brain then release a neurotransmitter called dopamine into the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, as pictured on your slide there. After the dopamine is released, it then fits into a specialized protein receptor on these other brain cells. And the result is a rush of untold pleasure. And that's what the brain gets hooked on. There are 3 parts of the brain, actually, which operate together. And these 3 parts are very, very important to understand. So let me go through each one of them with you. First of all is the dopamine piece, which we already talked about, which has to do with the pleasure reward center of the brain. Anything pleasurable affects a dopamine surge. Secondly is the memory and learning center. Now this has to do, and this is a very important piece for addicts, this has to do with the fact that the brain remembers. And the brain remembers the pleasure, the high, the kick, the thrill, the excitement, the danger, all of that. And it not only remembers it, it wants to get you back to that place. These are usually called triggers for addicts. These are the moments where their brain sends the signal out, let's do it. And let me give you a couple of examples of that. I had a sex addict that I was working with, and I asked him, well, now, what's the trigger for you to start using your pornography? And he said, the sound of the garage door going up. And what that told him, and the brain remembered, was that he was now able to do his pornography because his wife was leaving. Another time, another client that I had was telling me that he was a crack cocaine addict, and he did a lot of part-time job work, and people would pay him actual cash for the work that he did. His trigger then became, whenever his fingers touched that cash, bam, he'd be off to a crack house. So that memory learning centerpiece is a very, very important part of the addiction process. The third part there is the attention and judgment part, which is the decision-making center of the brain. It has to do with our foreheads, our prefrontal lobe part of our brain right here. This is the part of the brain that has to do with focus, attention, completion of tasks, short-term memory loss, and impulse control, braking system. So we're going to talk about this at another point when I talk about mental health disorders, but this is the part of the brain that is involved in what we have come to call attention deficit disorder. And it is a very important piece in understanding the behavior patterns of most addicts. So, but all three of these taken together combine to create addiction. Now, I spoke briefly about the genetic makeup. Let's look at it a little more closely here. For many people, particularly those with a certain genetic makeup, the experience of pleasure when doing a certain behavior is so gratifying and so rewarding that the brain starts sending out signals of do it again, do it again, do it again. I want more. And I'm not going to leave you alone until you give me that more. Why? Because the brain has fallen in love. The brain has now been hijacked to the point of causing severe disruption. Severe disruption in the following dimensions of a person's life. First, the physical. The human body can be severely damaged by addiction. The lungs, the heart, the skin, the liver, these and other parts of the body can all be disastrously affected by whatever addiction or addictions a person is involved with. Their social life is affected also. Addicts tend to become more and more isolated due to their fear of being found out. As a consequence, their lives shrink socially out of a sense of increasing paranoia. They, in effect, go into a state of hiding even from the ones who love them the most. That brings us then to their moral life. Addicts become more and more swallowed up with dangerous and unlawful activities. Their sense of morality can become lost as a consequence. And the result? Lying, stealing, running from the law, whatever it takes to keep the game of addiction going. Whatever it takes to allow their lives to become dominated. The next on our list is the emotional dimension, and this is a very, very important one. because their whole view of themselves becomes immersed in a kind of total dedication to their addiction. Consequently, they now become saturated with a sense of guilt, the conviction that I know I've done something wrong, so now I'm in effect on the run. The world of shame now becomes their home. And note that shame is different from guilt. Guilt is the conviction I've done something wrong, something bad. Shame is the conviction that I haven't just done something wrong, I am wrong. I'm a bad person. And recovery from addiction, as we will see at a later point, will be assisting the addict in getting out of the pit of shame they're living in and becoming a whole new person. Next is the cognitive dimension. This has to do with my thought patterns, how I think about myself and how I think about the world around me. Alcoholics Anonymous has a memorable phrase that indicates what this thought pattern is all about. They call it stinkin' thinking. It refers to the reality of what addiction does to my brain. I begin thinking of the world as a bad place, and I have to be bad to stay alive in it. Familial. This is a huge issue. Addiction severely affects the family of the addict. They feel like they get caught up in the whirlwind created by addiction. The family of the addict now comes to believe that it has been sucked into all the constant barrage of being hurt, sad, angry, fearful, and ashamed. They feel torn. They love the addict, but they hate what the addict has become. Next on our list is the spiritual dimension. The addict is now in a state of constant hiding. Hiding from themselves, hiding from their family, hiding from the law, and now hiding in the deepest and dearest part of themselves, their relationship with God. Their hiding now includes a total rejection of the place of spirituality in their lives. They avoid going to church at all costs. They mock the reality of a higher power. They scoff at anything that suggests an examination of their conscience. They live in shame, in hiding, in a sense of, I now belong to the street. And here's one that's not listed here. Legal. Running from the law, being caught by the law, all that involves in terms of being jailed, imprisoned, having so many rights that they took for granted now taken away from them. They are no longer their own person. They now belong to the system. The addict now develops new priorities, the things that come first in their life. And what happens is, because of this, the brain is now remolding brain circuits. It's redesigning the architecture of the brain, if you will. And it does it to assign supreme values now to things like cocaine, heroin, gambling, tattooing, whatever brings that sense of rush and excitement to the person. And it does that to the expense of other interests or priorities which are now pushed aside, such as health, the health of the person. This no longer becomes an important issue for them because it's subordinate to their desire for that chemical, that rush, that high. Work, job loss is very common with the in the life of addicts. Families are disrupted significantly due to addiction. They now become the people who are pacing the floor at night. They can't sleep, that know that they're being lied to. They feel that they're being stolen from. They just disrupts their whole life significantly. It's almost like they've been caught in a whirlwind, and their whole life now has been thrown apart almost because of the reality of addiction in someone they love. Then life itself, the most important priorities in life itself get pushed to the side because what takes center stage is everything involved in the addictive process. Addiction is now seen as a medical disease, and I can't emphasize enough how important this difference is made. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, it wasn't until 1995 that this revolution started taking place. And now we're at the point of most people involved in the world of psychology and working in the field of psychology and of psychiatry know that this is a brain disease, a medical disease, and not a moral failing. For so long, addicts have been shamed. Addicts have been told that they're worthless and that they're immoral people. And what I want you to hear very clearly from me is that we now know with certainty that this is not a moral failing. You are not a bad person. You are a good person with a horrible disease. And that makes all the difference in the world in the approach that's taken to healing this disease. As I've been saying all the way through this presentation, addiction is about a compulsive repetition I keep doing over and over again because the brain is demanding that. And here's the other, even worse part to this is it wants more each time because now I get used to just this much of whatever I'm doing. Now I got to get to this much and move even higher to more and more and more all the time. So it's a compulsive repetition of an activity that is pursued despite full recognition on the part of the user that life-damaging consequences will result. They're fully aware that they got to do more now, and then more after that, and then more, until it finally just steals life itself from the person, from the addict. Now, the hallmarks of addiction. In any addiction, doesn't matter which one it is, gambling, sexual addiction, alcohol, drugs, whatever, these are the hallmarks. You're going to find these in any addiction. Insatiable desire. Insatiable. I just can't get enough of it. Secondly, preoccupation. My brain is just there all the time thinking about it. How can I get more? When am I going to get some more? All of that kind of stuff just haunts the brain with this preoccupation. The third thing is uncontrollable urges. I just can't stop this on my own. And the urging gets to be more repetition and more repetitious and more frequent. And finally, the inability to stop on my own. I can't stop it. This thing is so powerful and so afflicting that it needs help from the outside. On my own, I can't stop it. It's just too powerful. Even though I'm continually making promises, especially to people that love me, and continual resolutions, but they're not enough. This is just too powerful a disease. Now, the word euphoria, of course, means a high, a sense of great relief and joy and enthusiasm and all that sort of thing. But brain scientists now know for certain that anything that's overly rewarding, overly immediately satisfying, anything that induces that high, that euphoria, or a profound calming effect, anything will result in the brain falling in love with it to the point of enslavement. Now, a major problem has always existed in the field of addiction, and that is we know we're far more successful in charting what goes wrong in the brain, but far more than in devising a way to fix it. And what we're going to see at a later point is that there is no quick fix for this. There will be a whole presentation that we'll make on what recovery from addiction looks like and what is required in it. Now, the architecture of the brain. In recent years, further brain research has shown. I talked to you about the research that was done in 1995. Research has been going on all the way since then. And now scientists know that aside from everything else we talked about in terms of dopamine, there are other neurotransmitters like GABA and glutamate. And the point is that this new architecture of the brain, if you will, because the brain has been changed, it's remolded, it's reshaped because of all of this, that this new architecture of the brain results in dependency, both physical and emotional dependency, to such an extent that whatever you just did, you'll want to do it again, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the cost, regardless of the damage that's done to your life and to the lives of people who love you. So, we're back to this notion of a chronic brain disease. You'll notice that first sentence there is the science is in. What that refers to is that for years, decades even, the field of psychiatry kept arguing you don't have the science that validates what your belief is about addiction. We now know that the science is there, it's in, we've got it. And the conclusion is, and the field of psychiatry now is almost fully on board with this, addiction is a chronic brain disease that has both genetic and environmental causes independent of a person's willpower. Willpower on its own is not going to be enough because this is just too strong, too powerful a disease. Now, there is no cure for the disease of addiction. And anybody tells you that there is a cure, it simply doesn't know what they're talking about. And there are also, I should add at this point, no such thing as people saying, well, I used to be an addict. I was an addict, past tense. You either are an addict or you never were. There is no past tense to it. There is recovery from it. And this is extremely important. There is recovery from addiction. But recovery from addiction involves at least 3 stages. Each of these 3 stages emphasizes that addiction is not only a brain disease, which I've been arguing all the way along here, it's also a soul disease. And by that I mean it affects the very heart and soul of a human being because it's a disease that involves all these dimensions. The physical, your body, emotional, what goes on within you in terms of your feelings that are primarily now awash in guilt and shame. Now, guilt and shame are different. Guilt is the feeling I get, I've done something wrong and I got to make amends for it. Shame is a much more powerful feeling. It's the feeling I haven't just done something wrong, I am wrong. It's a being feeling. I am a bad person. And what recovery from addiction is essentially going to be about is getting you out of that shame pit, that feeling that I'm a bad person, and into a whole new way of viewing yourself and the world around you. So what we know is how comprehensive the field of addiction is in terms of it involves physical, the emotional self, the spiritual life, your whole relationship with God. Your family life is often wrecked because of the power of this disease. It creates a whirlwind that the family gets caught up in, and it affects their lives and damages them in many, many ways. Economic, money is gone, jobs are lost, and many times legal ramifications that are involved in this addiction. Now, note this, at the heart of recovery is the belief that the spiritual must be addressed or the other dimensions will never be effectively resolved. So, stage one in recovery is the first thing the addict has to do, in my opinion, is look him or herself in the mirror and say to themselves, I am an addict. No way of downplaying it. I am an addict, through and through. The next step they have to take is, and not all of them do, I'm not only an addict, but I must stop my addiction. I must find recovery for my addiction. So, as I say here, this first stage of recovery is learning that it's a disease, a terrible disease. I have that disease, and I've got to seek recovery from that disease. And that's done, as I'm going to show in the next presentation that I do, in two ways primarily. First of all, through involvement with AA, which includes getting a sponsor, using the sponsor, and so forth. And secondly, dealing with any of the other mental health disorders that may be occurring in my life along with the addiction, like attention deficit disorder, like depression, like anxiety, like trauma, which is a major issue, particularly for people who are in prison. Very high relationship between trauma and addiction. If I just do AA without getting help for these other issues, it's going to affect my ability to stay with AA, and it'll seriously affect my inability to get out of this hole that I've dug that we call addiction. Now, stage two is sobriety is not recovery. Just stopping the behavior itself is what is called often the dry drunk syndrome, where just on my own, I'm not going to go to any of those meetings and I don't want to see any therapists. I'll just do it on my own. I'll just stop. I'll just quit. And it's just like I'm flying the plane all by myself. And that usually ends up not well, in that the person gets even sicker in terms of depression issues, anxiety issues, and so forth. So the second stage of recovery is to learn that sobriety alone is not recovery. Just stopping the behavior is not enough. A second order change, if you will, is required. And this involves a change in attitudes and behaviors. And my whole inner self needs to be changed, needs to be revolutionized, if you will. And that's exactly what we'll talk about when we get into recovery from this addiction. So this involves a change in attitudes and behaviors that include getting to the deeper issues that have helped enable, not cause necessarily, but enable that disease, help it go on, and help it even become more prominent in that person's life. Stage 3 is developing an attitude of gratitude. And this attitude is one that now embraces the disease as a means of helping them to move to a whole new level of existence. Not alone, but in the Lord. Recidivism rate. The word recidivism, of course, means people who fall back. They stop for a while, and the next thing you know, they're falling right back into the pit of addiction. And the rate is very high in the field of addiction. Why? Because it is so severe a disorder and ferocious a disorder. And on my own, as I've been arguing all along, can't get that job done. Need to get help from the outside. And so the recidivism rate is so high for two reasons: the very nature of the disease itself, which involves a genetic predisposition, chronicity, that is, it doesn't stop on its own, it just keeps right on going, multiple brain and neurochemical interactions that need to be taken care of. And finally, a need for a daily recovery commitment. One day at a time, learning how to take care of this disease. Now, another reality about addiction is what's called addiction interaction disorder. Most addicts are involved in more than one addiction. It's alcohol and drugs. It's drugs and gambling. It's gambling and sexual addiction. It's a whole bunch of them all thrown together. For example, 17% of addicts have only one addiction. It's not common. 4 out of 10 chemically dependent patients meet criteria for sex addiction. 35% of sex addicts have eating disorders, a powerful addiction all its own. And 45% of sex addicts are chemically dependent. This is what addiction is in its fullest context. It is a disease, a ferocious disease. It's a brain disease. It requires recovery on two fronts, both in terms of becoming a part of a new community called 12-step programming, and getting help from certified addiction therapists in terms of dealing with the other mental health disorders that may be present in their life. The good news for all of us is, in this day and age, we know more about this disease than we've ever known before, and we know now how to appropriately and consistently help people develop a whole new life, a whole new way of living. And that's my hope and prayer for each one of you. Thank you.